So let's talk about what's changed with Warhammer 40k's core gameplay, with a full overview of the rules and what they might mean for the game going forward. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do a full breakdown of all the things that seem to have changed for Warhammer 40k with this new pack of cards and mission deck, talking through all the different various elements of it, looking at what stayed the same and what's changed. Some things have had some minor tweaks, some things are exactly the same as before, and some things have changed in a massive way. For 10th edition 40k, we've basically had 3 different mission decks now, these basically being the most central and pushed way to play the game. It started with the Leviathan deck, then moved on to the Pariah Nexus one, and now we've got the simply named 2025-26 mission deck, and these ones are sort of the spiritual successor to the chapter approved books that Games Workshop used to bring out in 8th and 9th edition, where they had a very similar system of around about yearly updates with new missions and some tweaks on how you could play. Obviously, and I'm sure as Games Workshop would stress, you don't have to use these cards, you can stick with the Pariah Nexus ones or the Leviathan ones, play Crusade or any other game mode, though it does look like they'd be the ones that are recommended in tournaments and maybe have game balance changes made around them. They'll be the single most up-to-date and current version of 40k. The cards have a fairly similar format to what they had before. You still have your primary and secondary missions, though there have been a bunch of subtle changes to those. The biggest changes are that mission rules have been replaced by optional twists that many have really quite a big impact. It looks like these are no longer recommended for competitive play. Secret missions have been done away with for a new system of challenger cards that adds a more punchy and less big thinking catch-up mechanic, basically rewarding the trailing player with either extra stratagems or essentially almost free victory points. They're definitely fun and interesting, though receptions maybe being a little bit mixed, and it could perhaps cause a bit of weirdness or just give advantages to one player arbitrarily. And then as well as the much focused on 2,000 point games of 40k, they have some slightly different rules to make 1,000 point incursion games scale a bit better. Nothing major, but a bit more thought put into the 1,000 point game mode that lots of people play. And they have a fun system of asymmetric missions where you have a more obvious attacker and defender, where the two sides might have slightly different objectives and certainly have different deployment zones, with a theme of the attacker assailing the defender's positions. For the theming of this one simply called the 2025 to 2026 mission pack. The first 2 of them have had a lore theme, with Leviathan and Pariah Nexus focusing around areas of the 40k lore explored at that time. I was going to guess that this one might have been Nachmund, but it seems not. They've got some nice Imperial fists with some existing artwork taking some objectives on the colour, which I'd probably guess doesn't necessarily mean anything, but Pedro Cantor is certainly one of the miniatures that could get an update at some point down the line. They've kept his Finecast model on for quite a while. He's a big character, and I'm sure a lot of people welcome seeing him redone in Primaris scale. Leviathan was generally made in big numbers due to being in the 40k launch box. Unfortunately, Pariah Nexus found itself really quite hard to find for a lot of people. If you weren't somewhat snappy when they came back into stock, they could often sell out quite quickly, which really isn't particularly helpful for maybe one of the more standard ways to play Warhammer 40k. Hopefully they'll have a better stock of these 2025 to 2026 cards. I have heard that discount retailers have got some slightly pitiful amounts of them. Hopefully that doesn't mean that Games Workshop's just underproduced again and are going to sell out instantly. You might be able to use some third-party things to help out a bit. When the updates, the Tabletop Battles app and Warhapedia can both be used for Pariah Nexus games. Tabletop Battles doesn't have everything on it, but can be a good way to keep track of them without actually needing the physical cards if you've got the general details of them listed down. Given the 40k balance timeline, there's a good chance that these are going to be coming out with a big digital update at some point in the next 2 weeks. They tied the launch of the Pariah Nexus ones to one of the biggest digital overhauls 40k's ever had mid-edition. Loads of points rewrites, enormous balance data slate faction changes with all sorts of rules alters, and then even some core rules shifted around. Lots of things like stratagems and movement rules changed. At the moment we don't know how far they're going to go with that. One thing they have confirmed though is there's going to be a new tournament download pack, so another tournament companion with terrain layouts and any minor alterations listed on the cards. They stated that this will be ready to go on the 7th of June when the cards actually go out and ship out around the world. Probably some suggested missions and which parts of the pack are intended for tournament play, which reportedly does include the challenger cards but not the twists, and apparently it makes an errata to the No Prisoners card, which has been changed to a fixed primary for casual play but not for competitive events. In any case, with the general context of the cards aside, here's the rough overall content of the deck, unless I've miscounted anything, which is definitely very possible, and if I have I'll post any corrections down in the pinned comments, but they look like there are 10 primary missions for the main way that you score points in games, 2 sets of 19 secondary objectives which are identical decks for the attacker and defender, 9 challenger cards for the bonus catch-up mechanic, 9 twist cards for some alternative game rules, there's 6 regular deployment cards for Strike Force, and then 6 ones that are very slightly altered versions of those for Incursion, and then there's 5 ones specific to the asymmetric missions, 5 deployment cards with their altered deployment zones, and then 5 primary mission cards. Before we get into them in more detail, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, In Titan's Terrain. And this is one of the many options to get a board for the 40k terrain on the board. The main selling point of this one being ease of storage and transport, and being cheaper than Games Workshop by quite a bit. This terrain set does things quite differently to most. The design of it is 12 tiles in a 3x4 grid to make a 45x60 inch board, the right size for 2000.40k pretty much. Each of those tiles unfolds and up pops a building, so you sort of have a cardboard pop-up battlefield with the advantage that it's ready to go right out of the box with no hobbying or painting necessary, and also it can store completely flat, which is pretty handy for transport or packing away if you've not got loads of space. There's a few different designs available, and I'll talk through those at the end of the video, along with some of the pros and cons as well. There are a few trade-offs to the pop-up terrain style design, and it might not be for everyone. If you'd like to give their stuff a look over though, it'll be links down in the video description, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Let's get into the cards properly though, and for the game setup there's basically 3 different ways to play now: the 2000 point Strike Force, 1000 point Incursion, which is supposed to be mirrored deployment zones, and that just swaps out the deployment cards from Strike Force, and then Asymmetric War, where you swap out the deployment zones and primary objectives as mentioned. For their recommended ways to play, all the game modes use the challenger cards and the same secondary missions, and then as a bolt-on to those, they have the option of using a mission twist if you want to. These cards are ones that seem to completely replace the mission rules, and while the mission rules were supposed to be mandatory, these ones are completely optional, so I'd imagine there'll be a fair few games out there that just don't bother with them, or might add in one that they like. As mentioned, Games Workshop confirmed that these won't be recommended for tournament-style games, so they're more of a fun thing for casual games if you want to use them, and they range from being utterly wild and almost kind of game-breaking in their own way, to being fairly tame and just having a harmless twist to a game to give you a different challenge. Looking through the main checklist for deployment things, and it doesn't really look like too much has changed. It's pretty much the same process. Most of the armies, as per the core rules, draw the deployment and the primary mission and the twist card if you're using them. Set up the objectives on the battlefield. All games recommended to be played on a 44x60 inch game board as before, including incursion ones. Then roll off for the attacker and defender, or you can just choose if both players agree. Maybe that could be more relevant if you're playing the asymmetric missions. Then the players choose whether they're using the fixed or tactical secondary missions. The fixed ones are where you pick 2 and then you can score up to 20 victory points for those. The tactical ones are where you draw them turn on turn. It does look like there's one small but important change to the tactical missions, and it seems that tactical secondaries can be discarded at the end of either player's turn to generate that 1 command point. Previously it was just locked to being just yours, so for certain ones that you had to try and survive into the opponent's turn to attempt to succeed. If you were denied in doing that by your opponent, it could be kind of doubly painful, as they not only stop you getting victory points, but you wouldn't have chance to discard that card before you drew new ones, so I feel like that's quite a nice change there. It does look like you only get the command points that you generate from it though if you discard it in your turn, so I guess that's still a downside, but at least it's not blocking your hand for when you're drawing them in the next command phase. Otherwise, as best I can tell, the rest of it looks fairly similar. Declare reserves and leaders fairly similar to before, and the reserve restrictions around things not coming in first turn are still here. Deploy armies is still alternating, starting with a defender, and there's still that thing about Titanic units counting as 2 drops, so your opponent would drop 2 things after that. Then you do any redeploy rules before you know who's got first turn, then you roll for that. There are asymmetric missions, it's predetermined, and then you resolve any pre-game abilities. Overall fairly standard stuff. I think that the tactical secondary change is a good one though. I won't dwell too much on actions as they're still here and it looks like they're unchanged as well. There's still a big list of restrictions as to which units can and can't do them, and usually the idea is that you're sacrificing some damage for standing around and doing some battlefield admin of some sort, and you can't do it if you're OC0, are battle shocked, are in engagement range, or if you advanced or fell back this turn. Titanic characters are a little bit easier to do it with. The knights can do it in engagement range and they can still shoot if they're doing an action, so they get a small advantage there. For end of game scoring things, there's a small change here that's to do with the challenger cards. As before, when the game ends and you're adding up points, you can score up to a maximum of 50 victory points from primary missions, so anything that you've scored over that isn't counted, and then up to 40 victory points from secondary missions, a maximum of 20 victory points each if you're taking 2 fixed ones. The addition here is that you can now score up to 12 victory points for challenger cards. It'd be really unlikely to score that much, but I guess it's technically possible. You're probably far more likely to have somewhere between 0 to 6. And it looks like the victory points generated by challenger cards are a little bit unusually helpful there. They neither count as the primary missions nor secondaries, so you add up those 2 first and then you add any ones that you've scored with challengers, provided it doesn't take you over 90 victory points, which will be max score with your battle ready bonus. It means that the challenger victory points are kind of powerful, as they could make up shortfalls in either the primary missions or the secondary missions if you happen to have maxed one of them. As mentioned, most of the core cards have changed in some way, though I thought it was just worth mentioning that the deployment ones basically haven't. They've still got the exact same deployment zones that they had before. They're still Dawn of War and Hammer and Anvil for long board edges and short board edges, the corner deployments of Search and Destroy, the sort of stepped deployment zones of Sweeping Engagement and Tipping Point, and then the diagonals of Crucible of Battle. They've still got the same measurements on the objectives and the deployment zones and everything like that, and I felt like they worked pretty well before. It didn't feel like there was huge reasons to fix these ones, and I guess for anyone with various fancy deployment maps that marked out the deployment zones for you, they'll still work. Let's get into the changes though properly, and I thought we'd start with the changes that make reference to incursion and asymmetric missions, then talk about those new twist cards, then the challenger mechanics, and then the small changes to the primary and secondary missions, most of which aren't huge but could be important for one army or another. First up, these are the changes that you make to the game for the incursion missions. They adapt the mustery armies rule very slightly. In normal 40k army selection, you start by nominating a warlord, and then you can take up to 3 of any unit out there, and then up to 6 battle line and dedicated transports. Rather than being a rule of 3, incursion makes it a rule of 2, so you can only take 2 copies of each given datasheet, which might affect some cheap datasheets being taken in multiples I suppose, or a maximum of 4 battle line or 4 dedicated transports. I feel like that's not really going to be the most onerous thing in the world, as there's not really that much room for spamming 1,000 points. The other restriction from this one is that you can't take any more than 1 Titanic character model, so I guess they didn't want you just to take, say, 2 Imperial Knights and nothing else. Feels a bit oddly specific to limit that to Titanic characters. Doesn't actually stop you spamming any other Titanic unit out there, or doesn't stop you taking a Demon Primarch and a Titanic model. That one does feel like a rule aimed squarely at knights, maybe the idea being that you take 1 Titanic model and a bunch of Armigers or War Dogs at 1,000 points. Otherwise, there's 3 other changes. The deployment zones are drawn from an incursion-specific set, basically the only real change being that the objectives are slightly closer to the centre. I'll mention them again in a second, and otherwise it looks like they've tried to make the action burden a little bit easier on various armies out there. I guess you're going to have fewer units on the table, so fewer things to stand around cleansing objectives or retrieving data or whatever, and this lets battle line units get an advantage doing actions. They can advance and do an action, and if they do an action then it doesn't stop them from being able to shoot later in the turn, as it does with most other units. Seems nice enough to have a small nod towards making those easier, and maybe not the worst thing in the world to encourage a few more battle line things at these smaller game modes, as opposed to spam of great big tough stuff that you might not have the tools to deal with at this kind of points level. Finally, and maybe slightly weirdly, 1 secondary card can be opted to be discarded in Incursion. The Recover Assets one that requires you to do an action in your deployment zone, the midfield and the enemy deployment zone, that can just be thrown away if you draw it. I guess maybe they didn't like it as it needs at least 2 units to do actions to score anything on it, and you might just not have that many. I feel like there's a good chance that could be the reason for that, though it doesn't look like they've made any other changes to any other action-related secondaries, like Cleanse for example. I suppose you can do that with just 1 unit if you want the lower score for it. As mentioned for the Incursion game deployments, they're not really that different. They're done on the same deployment maps as the Strike Force games. It's just the objectives that are shifted, usually by around about 2 to 4 inches closer to the centre of the map. For example, on the Dawn of War ones, the ones that are near to the short board edges move 4 inches closer, and the ones to the long move 2. Some of them move 2 inches in both directions if they're towards a diagonal. Ultimately not really the biggest changes in the world, but I guess it seems sensible enough. Fewer units on the board and having a slightly more contained and focal battlefield might not be the worst idea ever. It means that things might be brought together to interact with each other a bit, as opposed to just having a few units just massively strung out and not able to interact. Overall, I think it is nice enough to see a little bit more support towards Incursion games. It felt like the previous mission packs had them as a bit of an afterthought. The reduced unit allocation thing, it seems sensible enough, though I still feel like you're going to be able to create some very skewed lists if you want to at Incursion level. The action thing is nice enough, though maybe gives advantages towards armies that actually naturally use their good battle line units as opposed to ones that don't quite so much. And the deployment thing seems fine, though maybe not crazy impactful. Overall to me maybe feels like a small improvement, though I'm genuinely not too sure how much it'd have big impacts from game to game, and I don't think it'll have a hugely different feel to just playing with say the Strike Force rules at 1,000 points. The other major different way to play are those asymmetric missions, and this one's done to represent games where you might have an obvious attacker and defender. The trend towards the mission packs has generally been all very balanced, with symmetrical deployments not to give one side an advantage over another. That does work well for pickup games or tournament play, though it is nice to have an option for other ways to play the game that's quite functional. Maybe having one army defending a strong point and one army assailing it. And it seems like that's the general idea here, aimed at casual games. The deployment zones for these are very different. In general, the defenders have a bigger deployment zone and they have 2 objectives in their home field. Then there's 2 objectives in no man's land and 1 somewhere in one of the attackers' deployment zones. Several of the primary missions have different ways for the attacker to score versus the defender, and there's a different way to doing the deployment as well, going back to a previous edition of 40k. And for this one, the attacker deploys their entire army first, then the defender deploys their entire force, so that'll be a big advantage to them at knowing exactly what's where and being able to perfectly counter-deploy them. And then in theory, to balance that out a bit, the attacker knows that they've gained first turn, so they can set up aggressively and maybe move things towards mid-board ruins and get them out of line of sight, and potentially have some first damage dealing if the board's fairly open. I guess that could maybe even speed up the deployment process just a little bit if it's all one player then all the other. In current 40k though, there doesn't really seem to be a particular go first win advantage, so at least theoretically it maybe could be a slight disadvantage to the attacker if they are going first, but maybe the defender's hidden everything so they can't really deal much damage and they have to wander out towards the objectives, then the defender can ambush them and hit them hard. For the deployment zones, here are just some very rough graphics for how they're more or less laid out, the green being the defender and the red the attacker, and the black points the objective markers. For tip of the spear, the defender gets an entire half of the board to deploy in, 2 objectives in there. Then there's a couple of sort of fortified defensive ones, one called Breakout, where the defender gets a strip in the middle of the board, and then one called Last Stand, where the defender gets a circle in the midst of the board, both of which getting their 2 objectives in once again, and being encircled on all sides. Apparently the idea of this one is to give the defender more terrain, so they have a bit of a strong point or fortified position to try and repel the enemy from. Then there's one called Defensive Line. This one's sort of a diagonal style deployment, and in the notes it says that maybe try and line up a bunch of terrain pieces along the diagonal, so the attacker's moving towards a defense line and try and breach in the defender's lines. Finally there's the one that Games Workshop showed off called Pincer Attack. That one has the defender deploying a sort of chevron sort of style, and then the attacker goes for 2 corner deployment zones to surge out towards them. Basically with most of these it does feel like the defender does have an advantage, having 2 home objectives that they could theoretically be scoring right away, though the missions do account for that a bit, and some of the deployment styles could be kind of unhelpful for the defender. I feel like the Last Stand one being encircled on all sides might not be the most helpful thing in the world, even if you could counter-deploy the attacker. Then the asymmetric missions have 5 primary missions, and I'll go through those quickly. On even ground has you score more victory points per objectives in no man's land and even more in the enemy deployment zone. I guess that'd mean that the defender would rack up a bunch more points because they have 2 deployment zone objectives, but if the attacker can get either of those then they're going to score pretty big. There's a very simple one called Holdout, and that's just literally 5 victory points per objective to a maximum of 15. Feels like the defender might have the advantage there. The ones in their own deployment zone would work equally well. There's one called Establish Control, where you need to hold your home objective markers, and if you do hold everyone in your deployment zone, then anything that you hold outside of the deployment zone is worth 5 victory points, otherwise everything is just worth 3. I guess in theory there'd be a little bit of a higher chance of the attacker taking the defender off one of their home objectives if they focused it, so it might be a bit more high stakes to do that, even if they do start out scoring bigger. Southern Power was one that they previewed on Warhammer Community and feels like an unusual one. The defender starts off with 50 victory points, and then the attacker does actions to steal victory points by doing actions on various objectives, more for the no man's land and more for the defender's deployment zone ones. I kind of wonder if that would interact weirdly with challenger cards. If the defender starts on 50 victory points, does that mean the attacker just starts getting those straight away? And then finally there's maybe a slightly complex one called Denied Resources. This one has the 2 sides score in very different ways. The defender nominates an objective to be the denial objective, and if they hold that at the end of the opponent's next turn or the end of the battle, then it counts as being denied, and they score 7 victory points if it was in their own deployment zone, 10 victory points if it was in no man's land, and then 16 victory points if it was in the enemy deployment zone. Then that objective is removed from the board and isn't used anymore. On the other hand, the attacker scores in a more normal way. 3 victory points for holding objectives in their own deployment zone, 5 for no man's land, and 8 in the enemy deployment zone. So basically they're trying to stop the opponent from denying those objectives and keeping them on the board, and then try and hold the ones that are up the board before they get removed. At least on paper it feels like if both armies are scrapping over the objectives fairly adequately, there should be at least a reasonable chance that both the defender or attacker could win, and it's only part of the story alongside the whole secondary game that's going along at the same time as well. Overall, hopefully should add a bit of interest for people who don't just want to play completely symmetrical deployment zones, but still maybe want a more formal suggested way to play a game than just make it up yourself. I feel like they could make for some fun casual games with some interesting objectives that favour and are forced trying to rush their opponent. Next up, I thought we'd take a look at the twist mechanic. This is the sort of bonus add-on rule that they've got, and these ones are basically the successor to the mission rule cards that we had in the previous decks, where each mission would also have a randomly drawn extra special rule added onto it. Things like, say, you can advance and do actions with battle line being one. There was one for manipulating reserves and turning them up early, one that stopped you using core stratagems in the first battle round, and one for army-wide sticky objectives, planting some flags and things. There were 10 of these, and it looks like there's 9 twist cards. While the previous were mandatory, the twist ones are optional. As mentioned, they're not going to be recommended for tournament play or competitive things, and I can kind of see why, to be honest, from reading them. There's just a couple of them that look like they could absolutely ruin the day of one army, and just kind of break the core rules of 40k in such a big way that it just doesn't seem very consistent with a fair game if one army is playing a fairly ranged army and one army is playing a fairly melee one. Not all of them are like that though, and several of them are a lot more in common with the previous mission rules, helpful things but don't exactly change the entire world. I feel like maybe keeping them optional for more casual games really isn't the worst idea in the world, as then you can decide whether or not you're going to use certain ones. The idea is that you draw them randomly, though I feel like if a couple of them were drawn in certain matchups, you'd probably just want to agree to redraw. It does mean that tournament-style games won't have a mission rule anymore, so I guess one less thing to keep track of. I'm not sure if that's a huge loss or not really. They did add one extra dimension to a game, and were something that helped to encourage battle line units a little bit, but at the same time were yet another thing to keep track of when there's quite a lot going on in 40k between all the unit interactions and the other resources you've got to manage. In any case, going through the twist cards and starting out with maybe the single craziest one, and it's a rule called Bloodlust. For this one, you get to select enemy units as charge targets within 18 inches rather than 12 inches, and when you roll charges with those, you roll a crazy 3d6 inches for your charge results rather than 2d6. That is just a pretty mad special rule to add in, and it's going to be a huge advantage to melee armies, allowing you to basically do hugely easy charges from deep strike. Your odds on to get in there, and massively so with a command point reroll. Usually when you get an extra d6 inches on your threat range, it's a powerful stratagem that's quite a big deal to have, things like advance and charge. So just to casually give that to every unit game-wide is kind of mad really, and definitely a big shake-up on how things normally work. I guess if you've got melee units, then reserves could be a far more interesting way to use them, as you can probably just drop them down and jump straight in. You could fairly easily combine that with all sorts of other movement shenanigans that you might have to make some very deep charges into enemy lines, and it's probably going to be very hard to screen against them. Definitely looks pretty crazy. I guess in 2 relatively balanced armies with some range and some melee, it might not be the worst thing in the world, but definitely looks unbalanced. I'll have melee units just performing far better than they're really costed for. I certainly wouldn't aim to play this one if you've got a melee force versus a range force. They're certainly not all that powerful though, as the next one is a fairly tame one in Lords of War. That's +3 attacks to your Warlord models, excluding vehicles. So that's range and melee attacks. I guess for plenty of models that's not the biggest thing in the world. Getting an extra 3 power fist attacks or something is certainly nice enough, but not really completely game breaking like the first one was. Doesn't seem to exclude monster warlords though, so I guess demon primarchs with their big scary attacks, or Tyranid hive tyrants with a heavy venom cannon, they're all fine. Could definitely help out one player more than the other though if they've chosen a fairly low key and subtle warlord as opposed to one that's a big fighty hitting one. Point blank gives your ranged weapons besides blast weapons the pistol keyword this game, so I guess you wouldn't really be able to lock up enemy shooting units as a viable strategy. A pretty solid boost to ranged units there. They can just afford to stand and shoot if they've got enough damage to be able to do so and they're not outright killed. Rapid Escalation is a sort of reserves one. A fifth of your army points wise can arrive from strategic reserves battle round 1 if desired, and these units must set up within 6 inches of a board edge outside of the opponent's deployment zone, and they can't arrive by deep strike rules. That one seems interesting enough and not completely crazy. Could have the possible for an interesting alpha strike or be used for annoying screening or something like that. Definitely possibilities there. Martial Pride gives you non-vehicle battle line units can do actions after advancing, and starting an action doesn't stop them shooting. Kind of similar to the Incursion missions there, but with the exclusion for vehicles. That definitely helps out battle line units do objectives. A pretty meaningful change there. But you would both need to actually have the units and think about using it. High Octane gives you automatic 6-inch advances all game long, so potentially a very fast moving game of 40k. You could have things jumping from terrain piece to terrain piece a lot faster. This one definitely looks like it'd be most wild with things like advance and charge style stratagems. Certainly doesn't seem like it'd be particularly fair with things like the Stormlance Task Force, where everything can advance and charge. So you basically have Space Marine melee things zooming around with a +6 inches to their movement range all game long. Then there's the return of Adapt or Die. This one allows you to swap out a fixed secondary once per game, or if you're using tactical secondaries, then twice per game you can draw an extra one and discard your least favourite. Seems like you'd have the potential to do some big brain plays with fixed ones, maybe score hard on one card at the start of the game, and then swap to something that you could do better at the end of the game. Just means that tactical secondaries could be a little bit easier to do if you're using those though. Ruinscape gives everything move through walls. Whenever you're making a normal or advanced move, you can move through terrain features horizontally. Again, this could be massively more helpful to monster and vehicle style armies, Imperial Knights armies heavy on the armigers would love that, and effectively just gain massive extra threat range on their units and be able to hide them really well, then jump on the enemy when they get close. That could easily be the sort of change that flips a close game into a big victory. And then finally, maybe another one of the most unbalanced ones is the Night Fighting one. And this basically means that you can only shoot units within 18 inches of them, so outside that you just literally can't target them. Again, kind of crazy given that that's an effect that you'd often use, say, a 1 command point stratagem to be able to do. Whereas this one, it's just everything all the time, and that one would just be incredibly bad news for any sort of gunline army, basically having to get close enough that the enemy can probably start charging them before they can deal any damage. Anything that you've paid points for a long range weapon, it just isn't going to get value out of that range. You'd have to get close. It still might not necessarily be insurmountable, particularly on dense boards. They stated on the card that it might be good for players without very much terrain on the board. 18 inches just seems very low to have always on all the time though. Feels like it might have just been a bit less crazy if it was something more like 24 inches or 30 inches, even if that would make it less impactful. Overall, kind of mixed feelings on those. Plenty of them seem pretty tame or reasonable enough ones that aren't going to change a game in a crazy way, but might give you some sort of different tactical option or fun ability. And then there's ones like the always 3d6 inch charging or the 18-inch night fighting ones, one of which helps heavy melee armies and one of which really hurts gunlines. Most of them are kind of fine, but it does seem maybe a little bit odd to have those two in the deck and then encourage people in casual games just to draw them at random. I'm sure a lot of the time with some fairly balanced armies with a good mix of things you'll be fine, but on the other hand it maybe puts a bit of pressure on the players to make sure that the twist cards aren't going to create a just crazy unbalanced game if you've got a ranged army fighting a melee one. Next up, let's go on to the challenge cards. These maybe seem to be the biggest change and most talked about innovation out of the deck, and these aims to be a catch-up mechanic for 40k. If one player gets a little way ahead on the score, then the player who's behind starts to get some advantages, either getting some fairly easy missions that they can achieve to get some victory points, or getting some bonus stratagems as another option, some of which in the right situations could be absolutely devastating, though given that you don't know which ones you're going to be getting, they might not always necessarily be crazily impactful. In any case, these replace the secret mission cards. In Leviathan we had the Gambits with the option to bin off primary points for one big kind of random thing. In Pariah Nexus we had the secret missions. These again a big play declared at the end of Battle Round 3 to limit your primary score but give you the chance to achieve one of 4 slightly hard to do missions and your opponent might be able to counterplay you. That definitely saw a bit more use in competitive play, but in more casual games they were just rarely bothered with. People just generally sticking to focusing on scoring the objectives that they were focusing on to start with. I'm not sure they'll be the biggest loss in the world, but were an interesting way that you could score for certain armies with some high-minded competitive play type things, perhaps building around battle line units warping into the backfield late game to try and score that one. In any case though, let's talk about the challenger cards that replace them. Just to start with, here's one example of the challenger card so we know what we're talking about. When you draw one of these, it both has a stratagem on it and also an objective. These are called a challenger stratagem or a challenger mission, very clearly marked out that it's one or the other. This one allows you to use the Force a Breach stratagem for 0 CP to move something through walls, or do an easy mission next to the battlefield edges for 3 victory points. All the stratagems are free 0 CP ones, and all the missions are 3 victory points at max, most of them being at least relatively straightforward to do. The idea of these things is they replace the secret mission with a completely different catch-up mechanic. The secret missions place the burden and foresight on a player to take a look at the end of Battle Round 3 as to whether or not it will be a good idea to use them based on the amount of primary points that they've scored, whereas this one is a fair bit more straightforward to be able to access and think about, with basically a set of 9 cards that you draw, and these ones just triggering if a player is behind by 6 victory points or more at the start of a battle round. If that condition's met and you're behind the other player by at least 6 victory points, then you gain a challenger card at the start of your command phase, so right at the start of the turn, so you've got the chance to plan to use it, I guess drawn at a very similar sort of time to as you draw tactical secondaries if you use them. I was wondering whether or not the challenger cards will be drawn completely at random or freely selected, and it seems that of the two it's the former. You have just one challenger deck of cards with those 9 cards presumably shuffled and face down, and then throughout the course of the game, if players draw challenger cards, you draw from the same deck of them, so you don't know who's going to get them at the start, and I suppose normally at absolute maximum you'd get a maximum of 4 challenger cards used, and a good chance you might only have 3 or less. Then, as mentioned, when you get the challenger card you either have the option of that free stratagem or that easy objective. You can either opt to do one of them or the other, but not both, and then it does look like it's a one-time opportunity. You can't basically bank the challenger card and keep that for a later turn if it makes sense. The card is discarded at the end of your turn, you can't save it for future turns, so it's basically a use now or never thing. There's a couple of further things about the stratagems and scoring. These ones are basically always meant to be free use stratagems that don't really interact with other stratagem rules in the normal way. You're not able to modify the cost of the Challenger stratagem by any rules, such as say, for example, the Calidus Assassin's +1 command point aura, and rules that might generate command points via the use of a stratagem aren't affected by Challenger stratagems. So say, for example, if you used a stratagem on a unit in range of Commander Shadowsoner or on an Imperial Guard unit with a Voxcaster, you wouldn't have the chance to farm a command point. I guess that kind of makes sense, so you're not able to turn one stratagem into a command point that you could use elsewhere and have a bit of a cascade effect. Otherwise, for the Challenger missions, the way that adding up the game score is kind of interesting on that. I was wondering if the score would count towards your either primary score or your secondary score, but the answer is it's neither. For the maximum score on your primary missions, that adds up to the maximum of 50 as per normal, and then for the secondary objectives you can score a maximum of 40 victory points from that, and no more than 20 VP per fixed one if you happen to take fixed. The Challenger missions are basically over and above both of those. Their victory points don't count towards either tally, and you can score a maximum of 12 Challenger victory points. To get that much will be really quite unlikely though. You would have had to been drawing Challenger cards all game long and being able to do every single mission maximally. But say if you scored something like 3 victory points or 6 victory points on Challenger missions, you add those to your points total after you've determined your maximum for primary and secondary. Say an army might have scored 50 primary victory points but only 30 secondary, so if you scored 80 points there and then you'd add on any extra that you'd have from the Challenger points, it just can't take that overall score past 90. That means they're really quite powerful victory points, as it means they can make up for a shortfall in either your primary or your secondary missions. As usual, the remaining 10 victory points to take you up to a total score of 100 are for that Battle Ready bonus, which is still present in this mission pack. Before we get into the cards themselves, I feel like that entire system does mean that a few things will happen. First up, compared with secret missions and gambits, which I think were often just very rarely seen in casual play, these ones will matter in impact games far more. There's no massive thought needed to them, just a simple advantage that you can use as a direct power boost and not having to make a big high-minded game-changing thought about points and things. It's just literally as simple as if you're 6 points behind then you're entitled to a card, and players will absolutely want to make use of them. If you're entitled to one of these, they're quite fun and quite powerful, so big motivation to remember and use them. As a result, I just see them being used far more as a mechanic compared with gambits and secret missions. Also, just by the maths of it, it's kind of somewhat unlikely to use these until Battle Round 3. You draw them at the start of the Battle Round, so it won't apply Round 1 at all. And then on Battle Round 2, no primary objectives have been scored yet, so it would require one player to have gone at least 6 victory points in the lead based on secondaries alone. I feel like that's not going to happen most games, but it could be possible. And sometimes you might actually have weird scenarios occurring, where say if you've got a secondary that you can achieve and that's going to wind you up something like 4 or 5 victory points behind the opponent, it might actually make sense to hold off, as at least a lot of the time the Challenger points are going to be worth at least 3 victory points to you, provided you've got some chaff units on hand to do actions and things. It does feel like there's at least some danger of discouraging players from scoring some points if it is just going to tip them just out of a Challenger card. Otherwise, from the random draw mechanic, it does mean that you can't really build around getting any one of the Challenger cards. Even if you drew something like 3 over the course of a game, that's only going to be a third of them, so you're not going to be able to build too hard for any one powerful stratagem buff that you might get. But I guess you could have a general idea of the ones that could really help out your army if you happened to lock into them. Let's get into them though and go through them one by one. And first up, for card number 1, we have Burst of Speed. The 0 command point stratagem Burst of Speed gives a unit a normal move of d6 inches at the end of your shooting phase, the restriction being that it can't have already moved this phase, and it can't move again until the end of this phase. I guess that's to stop it from comboing with all sorts of other shenanigans out there, maybe things like Fire and Fade style stratagems. As it goes, this one is a really big deal. It's a very powerful thing to get movement out of sequence like that. For a shooting unit, maybe one of the most obvious things is that you could just nose a big tank around the edge of terrain, just poke it so a sliver of it is seeing the enemy, then shoot something really hard, and then retreat that tank back to safety. That could be really powerful in itself, but you could just use it literally for speed, as the name implies. Move in the movement phase, perhaps shoot some guns, and then move an extra d6 inches in the shooting phase before charging, as it doesn't stop you charging like several similar stratagems do for this. And you could even combine it with things that allow you to advance and shoot or advance and charge, I suppose. Overall, it looks like a pretty great movement stratagem. The objective for this one is called Focus Effort, and for this one you just need to do a small amount of focus fire on one enemy unit. 2 of your units must make attacks against the same enemy target this turn, can be range or melee, and that enemy target must have lost at least 1 wound this turn as a result of any of those attacks. On the face of it, that one just seems super easy, quite likely to happen just completely incidentally if you've got any one sort of tough enemy threat to take it down and you're going to be shooting with multiple units or shooting something and then following it up with a charge. Overall, it seems like a powerful card, either really quite a nice stratagem or basically 3 free victory points. Next up, we've got a card with a stratagem All In. And you use this in the fight phase, and it gives you a 6-inch pile in and consolidate, and when you do so, you can opt to move closer to the nearest unit instead of the nearest model, if it makes more sense to you. I feel like adding in that option to an army isn't quite as crazy as the move, shoot, move one. It definitely could be a handy enough melee trick though. You could use it to charge a unit, wipe it out, and then consolidate into the next thing, or back onto an objective. It could still cause the opponent some headaches, and it could perhaps allow you to make some unusual combats happen if you wanted. Otherwise, for the objective, it's basically 3 victory points if you can do an action, and the stipulation for that action is that you need to be at least 18 inches away from enemy units when you do it. So if you've got some sort of chaff objective sitter camping in the backfield, then there's a pretty reasonable chance that that might be doable. I feel like unless you could see a really obvious big thing that you could do with the stratagem, then the victory points seem the way to go for that one. Next up, we've got one with a stratagem called Pivotal Moment. This one allows you to either advance shoot and charge or fall back shoot and charge with your unit. A pretty handy utility stratagem that quite a lot of armies have access to, and you get this one for free. Not everything gets advance and charge though, there's plenty of units that don't get that very easily, and you could use that on some things like say World Eaters 8-bound, when they don't have easy access to advance and charge anymore. And the fallback shoot and charge thing could be pretty meaningful as well, if you've got a big threat that gets locked up. For this one, the Challenger mission again is super easy. Just destroy one enemy unit this turn, and if you can manage that, then you gain 3 victory points. Usually you'd hope that by the time the Challenger cards are getting drawn and played, then that wouldn't be too bad. For card number 4, we've got Harboured Power. This one's quite a fun damage one, and in your shooting or fight phase, models equipped by this unit get the hazardous keyword, but then you get your choice of either lethal hits or sustained hits 1 as a damage buff for that squad. Overall, that's a pretty useful damage buff that could apply to some seriously big units out there. Being able to flex into lethal hits is usually quite a big deal. If you're hitting on a 3+ and wounding on a 5, then that's usually a 50% damage increase, so very meaningful. It's going to be fairly massive on any unit that maybe has, say, sustained hits on a 5+, like Orcs with the Warhorde stratagem, and then you could add lethal hits into that for free. There's plenty of things that get criticals on a 5+, or could be quite nice for anything that hits on a really inaccurate number. Again, Orc shooting comes to mind. Getting either sustained hits or lethal hits on a bunch of stuff hitting on a 5+ is going to be really efficient. Ideally, you want a big chunky central damage dealer unit, and it could take a chunk out of your squad with hazardous, but at the same time that could be a meaningful increase indeed. The Challenger mission for this one is called Dug In, and this one's scored at the end of your turn. For each objective marker that you hold, you score 1 victory point up to a maximum of 3. I guess that one could potentially be getting lower if you are getting beaten in a game, and you draw this towards the end. Given that you get to move up to objectives and try and scrape the enemy off them before you score it, there's a reasonable chance that you might be able to get multiple points here, and perhaps going up to a fairly good chance if the game's fairly close. Next up, we've got a card with a stratagem, Strategic Retreat, and you trigger this at the start of your shooting phase. A unit from your army returns to Strategic Reserve. The limitations are that you can't choose a monster or vehicle unit, and you can't choose a unit that's in engagement range. Otherwise, it doesn't have to be in any particular place on the board. It can just warp off the board. And return to reserve mechanics can be pretty handy, particularly in the late game when you might be drawing these. The timing of it maybe isn't excellent. It means that you'd have been able to move your unit around, but they have to disappear just after you've brought reinforcements in. So you're basically spending all of your turn out of action and not able to shoot or charge, and likely all of the enemy turn gone as well. So you are paying with a turn of that unit just not taking any effect on the battlefield. It could potentially have some interest with rapid ingress though. You could return something to Strategic Reserve, pay 1 command points to rapid ingress it on your opponent's next turn, and then maybe have that scary unit in a really strong position to deal some big damage. That would be a very strategic retreat indeed. Then for the Challenger mission, this one's called Zone Defense. For this one, you score 1 victory point per each of these areas that you have a non-aircraft, non-battleshock unit wholly within, and those areas are your deployment zone, no man's land, the enemy deployment zone, and within 6 inches of the battlefield centre. I'm a little bit unclear as to whether or not a unit within the 6 inches of the battlefield centre would count for no man's land as well. I guess they overlap. It does say on the card though to a maximum of 1 victory point per unit, so I guess that might imply probably not. Feels like that should be an absolutely super easy 2 victory points for your own deployment zone and no man's land, and then it just depends as to whether or not anything can achieve the central one or the enemy deployment zone. That will depend on the board state just a little bit more. Next up, card number 6's stratagem is Opportunistic Strike, and this one's somewhat similar to a free grenade usage up close. You use it in your shooting phase, and then basically 1 unit from your army that's not within engagement range and 1 enemy unit that's not within engagement range are both selected. If they're within 6 inches of each other, then you roll 6d6, and for each 4+ that you roll, that enemy unit takes a mortal wound. It means that on average you get around about 3 mortal wounds. You might swing a little bit high or low. It doesn't have some of the restrictions that Grenade has though. It looks like you can use this if you'd advanced or fallen back, and you can also use it if your unit's already shot as well, so you could try and shoot the enemy unit dead, and then if they fail, maybe use this to clean up. And I guess in theory you could combine it with a grenade throw as well, for around about 6 mortal wounds or so as a nasty strike against one enemy target. That could be pretty brutal against big things with high saves and high invulnerables. Otherwise, as with grenades, it could be interesting for just winning a small opportunistic fight, with one of your units taking down something they really shouldn't be able to. Otherwise, the challenger mission on this one is called Sow Chaos, and this one is about destroying models. If you've destroyed one or more enemy models from 2 or more different units, then you gain 3 victory points. I guess provided that you're playing against an enemy that's got a fair amount of infantry models on the board, that should be really, really easy. Could maybe be a bit tougher if you're playing against something like Knights or Chaos Knights and there aren't any infantry about. Though with a good turn, that could just equate to kill 2 units essentially for monsters and vehicles, which is definitely a bit more effort, but very thoroughly in line with your goals, and could be very doable if there's some things that are already damaged. Next up, card number 7 is Great Haste. The free stratagem for this one is a plus d6 inches to your move characteristic in the movement phase. Looks like that's a bit of a common theme with the cards, along with the advance and shoot and charge one. That's basically 3 different ones where you can basically add an extra d6 inches to a unit's movement. Getting them in the different phases has its pros and cons. You wouldn't be able to use this to jump, shoot, jump like you could with the shooting one, but I guess knowing the d6 inch movement in your movement phase is pretty handy, as it means that you can plan as to whether or not it's worth going for a long charge or something like that, as you know the result of the d6 before you have to move. It's definitely a little bit random, and if you roll low it could just literally be plus 1 or 2 inches to your movement, which could be quite disappointing. Though I guess you could also combo it with things that allow advance and charge in one way or another, and that means that you could add 2d6 inches to your movement characteristic overall, which could be pretty big and meaningful. For this one, the challenger mission is called Over the Line, and for this one you need 1 or more units in your army that aren't aircraft or battle shocked units to be within the enemy deployment zone, and if you can achieve that at the end of the turn, then it's 3 victory points. Looks like this one is really quite similar to the behind enemy line secondary objective, though a touch easier due to the restriction being within and not wholly within, so you could just have a unit tow into the deployment and score this. Compared with some of the rest of the challenger missions, it feels a little bit less guaranteed than some of them. You might just not have any units that are in a good position to do this, though potentially if you do happen to draw tactical secondaries to jump into the enemy deployment zone, you could potentially have just 1 unit rack up a pretty insane amount of victory points. Maybe if you also drew behind enemy lines, and perhaps even the established locust one at the same time, if all the stars aligned. I would possibly say that this one could be one of the less reliably good cards though that's relevant in every situation. Next up we have card number 8, which is Renewed Focus. This one gives you a damage boost to 1 unit, allowing you to reroll hit rolls of 1 and wound rolls of 1 with a unit in the shooting or fight phase, provided you've not got other things going on like lethal hits or already having rerolls to complicate things. Normally this gives you a plus 36% damage boost in isolation, and that's pretty big and meaningful for 1 command point. If you can target some really big scary shooting units, then that's going to go a long way, or potentially a charging unit that you want to hit really hard this turn. The challenger mission for this one is Establish Comms, and this one has you do an action in the shooting phase with 1 unit that's at least 15 inches away from all of your other units, which is an interesting restriction. I guess you could potentially move both units to make that happen to try and get the distance away, or you could do it with some sort of far-flung deep striker or strategic reserve unit, or maybe even just a unit lurking in the backfield if you don't happen to have anything else nearby. I feel like that could either be super easy or genuinely quite difficult, depending on how your arm is set up. Finally, for the challenger cards, there's this Force a Breach one. This one allows you to move through enemy models and terrain pieces using normal or advanced moves in your movement phase. I guess at least theoretically it could be kind of big for a big monster or vehicle wanting to charge something. Being able just to completely bypass ruins is quite a big deal. They wouldn't know that you're going to get this by the time that you're setting it up, so it's not like you'd be tucking it away in terrain knowing that you could phase through walls next turn. It maybe feels like it's a bit less used for infantry models, though I guess in theory you could use it to beat screens in your way, potentially move over something provided you've got the movement to clear an enemy unit and then charge something behind it potentially. Feels maybe a little bit situational. I guess you might have something that could matter in a big way to that, though I feel like quite a lot of the time it might just be going for the victory points. Otherwise, the objective for this one is called Secure Extraction Zone, and for this one you do an action in your shooting phase for 1 unit that's not in your deployment zone and within 9 inches of a board edge, so sort of a little bit like the old containment mission which appears to have gone away, and I would rate that one as really quite an easy one, provided you've got some chaff units around the board doing some screening or nuisance things. That could be very doable. Overall for the cards themselves, there are some potentially pretty wild stratagem effects that could have some seriously powerful combos with certain armies, but at the same time there are a fair few stratagems that just wouldn't be that helpful to a good amount of armies out there. like say drawing move through walls when you've got a mainly infantry army, or perhaps the return to reserves one if you've got nothing that it makes sense to return to reserve with, and everything really needs to be on the board at the moment to do its job and deal damage and score things. I do quite like the design choice where you've got the choice between the free stratagem and the objective though. Maybe it makes them just a little bit more predictably useful. The stratagem might be helpful to armies but might not, but at the very least it should be a fairly easy secondary objective to do, depending on the exact circumstances. Overall, for initial impressions of them, they do seem a little bit stronger than I'd expected in terms of the effects that they've got, and do add a pretty great variety of pretty powerful options. I could see lots of ways in which those stratagems could produce a pretty big swing in the game, which I guess is what Games Workshop's intention is, to allow a trailing player to be able to catch up a touch. As mentioned, it seems nice enough that the challenger objective option always gives you the choice to basically score 3 victory points fairly easily if the stratagem is a dud for your army. I feel like in some situations the choice between using the stratagem or taking the victory points could be genuinely quite tricky for some cards. For example, if you can make a fairly safe-ish charge shorter, but that charge is pretty game critical, do you spend the extra movement and get d6 inches closer towards that, where it could just be a 1, or you could have just been about to make that charge anyway, or do you go for 3 victory points, even if it might mean that you need to move a unit out of position a bit, while they are maybe giving a slightly arbitrary advantage to one player? There's still going to be a mechanic in which you can express a bit of player skill and agency and make the right choice with the cards to achieve maximum power with it. I guess for a lot of 40k games out there, it could well work to help a player who's getting stomped to have a few more tricks. Maybe it does enough to actually help their army enough to bring back and make the game a fair bit closer. Maybe it doesn't and just gives them some fun toys to play with and a little bit more excitement with some powerful stratagems to throw around and perhaps make their eventual defeat a bit more interesting with some sort of glorious last stand, big damage move or fast movement shenanigans. I would guess at first glance it'll probably increase the amount of close games rather than decrease. They might not necessarily have all that much effect at all. For reactions of these, they seem to have been pretty mixed on the internet. Plenty of people are interested enough to give them a go. As I said in previous videos, there's at least some chance that for competitive games it could be sort of weirdly counterproductive. Maybe the most obvious thing being for armies that were planning to score really high later in the game, but for the first few turns either being cagey or focusing on damage dealing to blast the enemy to bits. You might have a game that without the challenger mechanic, one player with a big damage dealer army was on track to win anyway, and there's at least a reasonable chance they could be trailing maybe rounds 3 or perhaps round 4 as well. Pick up some challenger cards and just further double down on making them absolutely dominate with a huge scoring round turn 5. As mentioned earlier, it could also produce weird counterproductive things, where say if you can score a small secondary for 2 victory points and that stops you getting a challenger card, in some situations I could see that being as something that you might even want to avoid. There's a pretty reasonable chance that you could pick up an easy 3 victory point objective from the challenger card if the stratagem isn't more useful to your army, and sometimes it might well be. Otherwise, again, theoretically, it kind of punishes good plays in getting ahead in the game. If a player has genuinely played a better game of Warhammer 40k than their opponent and managed to get 6 victory points ahead, it does maybe feel like they're being sort of punished when all of a sudden they draw a card that gives them 3 victory points almost as a freebie. Though I guess on the other hand, it could balance against wild swings of bad luck. If one player got unlucky, lost a key unit due to the dice, or failed a big charge that stopped them scoring things, the cards themselves, as mentioned, are a way that you could express game skill. So it's pretty reasonable that a player who knows the game really well could get far more value out of a challenger card than otherwise. Finally though, for our look through the cards, we've got the primary and secondary missions. The primary missions being worth 50 victory points to each player in total, usually being pretty focused on the primary objective markers, and then the secondary missions can either be used fixed or tactical, either way scoring up to a maximum of 40 VP. While sometimes between mission packs we've had things that have kind of entirely rewritten some of these ones more feel like they've had small refinement changes. Lots of small quality of life improvements to stop the cards doing dumb stuff in one way or another. A couple of things to perhaps help first turn advantages, giving a few more lower scoring options for secondary objectives that could occasionally be really quite hard, and stopping you locking into a crazy amount of victory points if you say Drew bring it down in the right turn. Let's talk through all the things that stayed the same and all the things that changed, starting with the primary missions. Getting into it, and first up we have the primary mission cards. In general, these are the ones that determine the missions and how they're played. The primary missions determine how you score points on the battlefield. It looks like in the previous pack there were 9 of them. It now looks like there's 10 of them for these sort of 2,000 point standard match play games. And that's been made by hidden supplies, a previous mission rule becoming a primary mission. Quite a lot of these are entirely unchanged, not really broken, so don't really need fixing really. Take and Hold, Linchpin, Scorched Earth, and Purge the Foe are all the same, as is Unexploded Ordnance. The Linchpin one still has the 15 victory point cap like it was done in the tournament errata. Most of them tend to revolve around some form of scoring objectives at the end of your command phase, usually with a small twist of some sort. Perhaps the most surprising one to see completely unchanged is Unexploded Ordnance. This one's generally not been a particularly popular one, just because it's got quite a big go-first advantage on paper. If you've got expendable units to push back a bunch of the hazard markers towards the opponent, they might find it hard to catch up and get them to your deployment zone to start scoring things unless they're really overwhelming your forces on the damage front. And as a result, this one's rarely played in competitive games as a result. It does have some trade-offs though. If you want to push all the objectives up, you might well have to expose a bunch of units, and the enemy won't have to do quite as much work to get their units in position as they'll have already moved the objectives towards them, at least early on. And having a quick look at the data from Goonhammer's 40k stat center, looks like the first turn advantage isn't exactly an enormous one, at least in more casual games, though it still seems like one of the ones with the biggest go-first win rate. Otherwise, the new mission is Hidden Supplies. Previously, this was a mission rule twist, and it was the one where you split the central objective in two. So rather than having one objective in the midboard, you now have two objectives that are then placed 6 inches towards one of the battlefield corners. The core rule for splitting the objective is basically the same. If No Man's Land features some corners of the board in it, then you move the newly created objective 6 inches towards those two corners. Otherwise you roll off and the winning player determines which corners the objectives get pushed towards. Then it's a fairly simple scoring mission, just based around the objectives in the midboard. You score 5 victory points if you control 1 marker at the end of your command phase, 10 victory points if you control 2. And 15 victory points if you control more than your opponent, and these are just based on ones for objective markers not in your own deployment zone, so a good incentive to get out and fight over the midboard. Maybe seems sensible enough to have this as a primary mission as opposed to a mission rule, as it could just mean that some missions act kind of unusually if you have vastly more objectives on the table. Let's move on to the other primary missions though, and next up we have some tweaks to Terraform. This is basically the one where you can do actions to terraform objectives in the midboard. And in the current system, you'd have to survive until the end of your enemy turn with those units, and then that means that objective is basically scoring you points for the rest of the game, 2 victory points per turn. This one's seen quite a few changes really. Now the terraform action is a lot easier to do, and basically you can just move up to an objective, do the terraform action, and it completes at the end of the turn, provided you still control that point, which normally you should. Perhaps the biggest difference with this one though is that you can now terraform objectives that have already been terraformed by your opponent, and if you do that, then it's no longer counted as terraformed by your opponent and counts as terraformed by you instead. I think that is quite nice to stop someone who just does a bunch of objectives very early with some early board control from racking up a crazy amount of points over the course of the game. Finally, there's also a tweak to the way scoring is done as well. Now both players score 1 victory point per terraformed objective at the end of every turn, not just 2 victory points in your command phase. So I guess that's a little bit more granular and might interact a little bit better with, say, the starts and ends of the game, and have some immediate reward when you do manage to do the terraform action. Scoring at the end of the turn as well as in the command phase does seem a little bit more fiddly though. Overall, I'd still say that's probably an improvement. It was one of the other missions that maybe had a bit of a potential for go-first advantages if you could get those terraforms off before the opponent had a chance to. I quite like the mechanic of being able to take back objectives and then plant your flag in them as opposed to the opponents once you control them again. Next up, we've got the Ritual, which has had a small change. This one is the one where you can do an action to create a new objective per turn, and then the idea is to fight over the No Man's Land objectives, scoring 5 victory points per No Man's Land objective held in the command phase. Broadly speaking, this one's pretty similar. The only big change is that you now no longer remove any objectives from the board, so I guess that means that usually you start with 3 objectives in the midboard, and then you've got the potential to add more. That would mean that there's just an absolute ton of objectives on the midboard, and you can start scoring stuff very quickly. I guess it'll be a pretty high scoring mission as it goes. Next up, there's Supply Drop. This is the one where you basically have objectives in the midboard gradually disappear, but then they get higher stakes and more victory points for holding the last one towards the end of the game. The change with this one now is that it's always the midboard objective that disappears last, and then you just randomise the other 2 at the start of the game. You have an Alpha and Omega one. The Alpha one disappears first at the start of round 4. The Omega one disappears second at the start of round 5, and then you'll be left with the midboard objective at the end of the game, which will be worth the big 15 victory point swing. Overall, I feel like that's probably a small and positive improvement there. It stops you just looking into having the final objective maybe on your natural expansion objective, if you do have one that's easier to hold than the others. I feel like forcing both armies to try and take the centre of the board at the end feels pretty appropriate, and also gives you one less thing to remember as well, which doesn't hurt. I've definitely had games of that, where by the time it gets to round 4, one or both players have forgotten exactly which order they should be disappearing in. Finally, for the primary missions, there's Burden of Trust, and this is the primary mission where you task units to guard objective markers, and if a guarding unit survives on an objective marker, then you get an additional 2 victory points at the end of the opponent's turn. This one's had a change which looks like it's aimed to give a little advantage to the player going second, as I believe that under the current rules for it, basically they'd have one less turn worth of being able to score the guarding objectives bit, as they wouldn't be able to score any victory points for objectives they guard in round 5. They'd set to guard them in their turn, and then there's no enemy turn to score at the end of it. As a result, Games Workshop have let the player going second guard objectives in turn 1. So I guess that means you get your home field one, and then you might be able to do something with infiltrators in the midboard, at least if it made sense to and the opponent couldn't just immediately take them away. I guess that could just go a little way to balance them out. It means that the player going second could score guarding points for things they set to guard in turns 1 to 4, so they score those points in rounds 2 to 5. And then for the player going first, they'd be setting things to guard at the top of battle rounds 2 to 5, and then scoring them at the end of that. Overall, not the biggest change in the world. I guess might end up with the player going second getting an extra couple of victory points or so. Those are the primary missions, but let's move on to the secondary mission cards. And again, it looks like there's one more card included here. Looks like there's 19 cards as opposed to 18 of them, with one being removed in containment, the one where you did actions near the board edges, and then 2 new ones being added in its place. Let's go through them all. Plenty of them haven't been changed, around about half of them have. First up, we've got Recover Assets. This is the one where you do actions both in your deployment zone, the midboard, and also the enemy deployment zone if you can. And then if you manage to achieve doing the action in 2 of those areas, you gain 3 victory points, and if you do it in 2 of those areas, you gain 5. The victory points have had a small tweak, dropping down from 6 victory points for doing it in 3 areas to 5. But at the same time, the action's quite a lot easier to do. Previously, you had to survive from your turn all the way through the enemy turn to the end of theirs, so they'd have the chance to take your units down. Now it just completes at the end of the turn, so that one should be a very, very easy one to complete with a unit in your backfield and then something towing into the midboard. And if you happen to have some deep strikers drop down into the enemy backfield, you could even do it with something fragile now. Expect them to die the next turn, but get an extra 2 victory points if that made sense. That one still can't be taken as fixed. They removed that as an option early on for competitive play in the last Pariah Nexus update. Otherwise, Area Denial, keeping enemies away from the centre of the board, that's unchanged, and the same for Sabotage with doing actions and terrain features. They're both remaining the same. It's the same for Overwhelming Force, destroying enemy units that are in range of objective markers, 3 victory points or 5 victory points as previously. Extend Battle Lines though has seen some changes though. This one's now 4 victory points for controlling your home objective and 1 objective in no man's land at the end of your turn, or 2 victory points if you just hold an objective in no man's land full stop. The maximum victory points from this one has been toned down a bit. It's now 4 victory points down from 5, but also the 2 victory point goal has got a lot easier as well. Previously, you could only do that if you just had the 1 unit left on the board, but now that restriction's gone, so if the opponents manage to take your home field objective, you can still score 2 victory points at least relatively easier with this. A Tempting Target is a completely new secondary objective, and this one's kind of similar to some previous rules. If you draw this one, then your opponent selects 1 no man's land objective to be the Tempting Target objective marker, and then if you control that at the end of either player turn, then you score 5 victory points. Basically, that could be a big win one if you can manage to take that point, but on the other hand, unless you've got some really good control of the midboard and are pushing the opponent off all the objectives, there's a good chance you might have to really step up and take down a lot of their things, or put your units in positions where they're going to be attacked back. It definitely feels like an objective where you might be able to score this, but then lose a huge chunk of your army due to being forced to push up in places that you might not have normally wanted to. Next up, there's a small change to engage on all fronts. Interestingly enough, this one's got a little bit easier. It's the same one for scoring non-aircraft and non-battleshock units that are wholly within table quarters, and also not within 6 inches of the centre of the board. You get 4 victory points for 4 table quarters scored, 2 victory points for 3, and now there's a small bonus for if you've only got 2 table quarters, you still get 1 victory point. I feel like that might come up from time to time, particularly later in the game for players who've not got much of their army left. If drawn, then that could be one that at least you could get something from. Storm Hostile Objective is unchanged, 4 victory points for taking an objective that your opponent previously held, and you've got the option to shuffle it back into the deck turn 1 if you want to. And then Cleanse has had a small boost. This one is one where you do actions on an objective that isn't in your deployment zone, and they complete at the end of the turn. You get 2 victory points if you cleanse 1 marker, and then if you cleanse 2, it's now 4 victory points if you took this as the fixed objective, and 5 victory points if you've just drawn it as a tactical one. I guess the reward for managing to do that on 2 midboard objectives goes up slightly in tactical, so a slightly more powerful card than it was before, but does require some commitment. Next up, Behind Enemy Lines is unchanged, and it can still be fixed. 3 victory points if you get an unit entirely within the enemy deployment zone, or 4 victory points if you can get 2. Established Locus is similarly unchanged. doing an action within 6 inches of the centre of the board or the enemy deployment zone, a higher reward if you can do it in the enemy drop zone. Assassination though has seen some changes. It looks like it's the exact same as it was for Tactical. There you just get 5 victory points for killing at least 1 character unit by the end of the battle round, and you still score it if every character model in the enemy army is already destroyed. For Fixed though, there's been a very small nerf to it. You now only get 3 victory points if a character model with less than 4 wounds is killed, and 4 victory points with one for 4 wounds or more. It already scored a bit lower for the Fixed version for characters in general, but now if the opponent's got a few characters that are just 3 wound support characters, you won't get as much of a reward for offing those. Not exactly the biggest change in the world, only kind of relevant against a few armies that maybe spam those smaller character units. Next up, some of the biggest changes come to the sort of kill thing secondary cards. Bring it down, Call the Horde, and No Prisoners. Bring it down is still the same if you take it fixed, 2 victory points per enemy or monster vehicle unit that's destroyed, and then plus 2 victory points if the total wounds characteristic of that unit was 15 or more, and plus an extra 2 if it was 20 or more. If this was drawn as a tactical card though, it's basically 4 victory points or nothing, just literally destroy any one vehicle or monster unit, and if you get that, you get the 4 victory points, even if it's something light like a Sentinel or something, so I guess a slight buff there. But at the same time, if you happen to destroy a whole bunch of vehicles that turn, you can no longer score an absolutely enormous amount of points. I guess making it a bit less random, just if it happened to fall on a turn where you're going to destroy loads of enemy tanks. Overall, that one seems like a sensible enough change, really. Call the Horde has had a change as well. Previously, this was either destroy a unit with 20 or more models in it, or 25 or more wounds, and it had to be an infantry unit, and in the tournament pack they'd patched out the workaround of opting to take 19 models when you paid for 20. Now though, the units that count for it has been expanded quite a lot. Now any unit that's got a starting strength of 13 or more after attached characters will count for Call the Horde. So I guess that would account for things for, say, like Astra Militarum 10-man units with a 5-man command squad now, or basically any other unit that you've got around about 15 models. I suppose occasional character choices might bump that up to that level now. Say like a Chaos Space Marine Dark Apostle with his Dark Disciples joining a 10-man legionary unit. They've also capped it in tactical, so you can only score a maximum of 5 victory points for it, kind of similar to Bring It Down. So I guess that'd prevent the very occasional swing high if you just happen to kill multiple of these units in one turn, which doesn't seem too likely for most armies. I guess it means if you want to include a unit of that sort of size to stop your opponent being able to redraw it, then that could be a little bit easier than it was previously as well. Rather weirdly, there's also been a sort of change and then a reverse of that change to No Prisoners. This is the Destroy Enemy Units one, 2 victory points per unit destroyed this battle round, up to a maximum of 5 VP. Often not the hardest one to do if you draw it tactical, but now weirdly there's an option to take it fixed, but at the same time Games Workshop have said that in their Tournament Errata pack, you won't be able to do it fixed in the more competitive style tournament pack games. That definitely feels like it's sending mixed messages. I guess in more casual games it'll be an option, and you could stack it with other things like Bring It Down if you happen to be facing loads of vehicles, for example. Could be a pretty straightforward one to take if there's just loads of enemy units on the table of one sort or another. For the fixed objective, there is a small tweak as well, saying that you don't count character keyword models, aside from ones that have a bodyguard. Certainly feels like a bit on the mixed message side to make it an option to be a fixed secondary, but also to ban that option in tournament games. Next up, we've got the often easy secure no man's land, completely unchanged. Again, that'll just be taking 2 objectives in the midboard, and defend stronghold is unchanged as well. 3 victory points to hold onto your home field objective at the end of the enemy turn. March for Death has seen a change to make it a bit easier as well. And this is the one where the opponent selects 3 units, and if you can destroy any of them, then you score 5 victory points. So it might be more doable late game, but often in the early game it's just going to be completely impossible. Now, as an added bonus, you can get a small kill 1 unit as an added incentive. After the opponent selected their 3 targets for the 5 victory point reward, you get to select 1 unit, and if you destroy that unit, you get a smaller 2 victory point reward, so presumably you select the unit that's the smallest and easiest thing to kill, or one that you know that you're absolutely going to try to kill maximally this turn. I quite like that as a change. It means it's a little bit less all or nothing. At least gives you a pretty reasonable chance to net 2 victory points in the early game, unless there's literally nothing of your opponents that you're going to be able to bring down this turn. Finally, there's one last new secondary objective, and that one's called Display of Might. This one must be redrawn if you draw it battle round 1, no choices on that, and this one gains you points for getting more units than your opponent into no man's land, checked at the end of your turn. If you manage to do that, then you get 4 victory points. I guess while the new version of No Prisoners might punish big multiple small unit armies, this one might reward them. It might depend heavily on exactly when it's drawn, how the game's going, and the army that you're playing with and against, but if aimed for doesn't really feel like it's the hardest one in the world, occasionally that'll be really quite easy, sometimes it just won't be possible at all. Overall, between all that, that's a lot of small changes to the secondary missions. Most of them don't really change the nature of the objective all that much, just perhaps round them out a bit, stopping them from flexing quite too high if you get lucky, and giving you a couple of low scoring opportunities, such as the Engage on All Fronts one or the Marked for Death. In general, I think if you liked them before, then you'll probably like them now, and otherwise not too much has changed. Might just be a little bit annoying trying to keep track of a fair few changes, though I guess with mission decks it's easy enough, as the cards literally tell you what the objective is as you do it. That just about brings us to the end of this one though. Overall, for first impressions, I feel like it's kind of mixed with this one for me. The primary and secondary changes, at least at first impressions, seem pretty reasonable enough. Feels like they could have done something with unexploded ordnance though, given that one was just a bit of an annoying one for a lot of people out there. The challenger cards definitely have fun factor, and I feel like they're a lot easier to use, and a bit more of an exciting mechanic in my opinion versus the secret missions, but on the other hand, maybe the fundamental idea of them does feel a bit on the odd side. One player gets ahead, so the other player gets an advantage to catch up that the first player didn't get, and it feels like it could give advantages to armies that want to push the table and then win late game on points, or even potentially the player going second, just due to often a lot of their points coming from a big scoring round on Battle Round 5. I think for a fair few games though, they will achieve their aim of making the game a little bit closer than it might have been otherwise, at least giving a bit more entertainment to a player who's getting beaten. Just might be a bit feels bad if they swing a close game, or cause weird gameplay things like not scoring a point or two in the hopes of getting an easy 3 points next turn. The twists maybe feel like a bit of a step back, just because they've basically written a couple of really unbalanced ones, and that's why they're not putting them in the tournament play games. Maybe means that those style of games are just going to have one bit less variety than they used to. Whereas if you just use the twist rules as written, every so often you're just going to have games that massively favour melee armies when you get 3d6-inch charges or turn off shooting at 18 inches. If they're aimed for casual games though, players could certainly adapt and agree which one they wanted to use or not use. Otherwise the incursion missions and the asymmetric ones feel like a broad win in my opinion. 1,000-point incursion games are a pretty common thing to be played in casual play, so good to see a little bit better support for them even if it doesn't change crazy amounts, and the asymmetric missions could add a bit of variety, rather than literally everything having to be a mirror match, even if they're not intended to be the epitome of balance. Overall, I don't think it's going to make the deck unplayable or anything like that, but feels like there's an equal amount of maybe slightly more negative things to balance out the positive, at least from first impressions from me. I'll certainly look forward to playing the games though. I feel like the challenger cards and things definitely could add a touch of the unexpected, which could be kind of fun even if they might be a touch random. I look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below though. What are your initial takes on the cards? Are the changes good or bad? Finally, before I go, I'll just cycle back to Titan's Terrain in the video sponsor and talk a little bit more about their pop-up folding cardboard terrain system. As mentioned, compared with most other terrain sets out there, I feel like there's some quite big advantages and disadvantages to this one. It's really easy to transport given that it folds flat and can fit in a box set the same size as a standard board game. Can be a big feature for some. It's far cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop terrain and at least somewhat comparable to MDF. It's cheaper than most plastic variants that I've seen that do a whole board, and they don't need any painting or assembly. It's ready to go absolutely immediately right out of the box. For potential downsides, it's a bit less sturdy and hard wearing than plastic or MDF given it's made of cardboard and designed to fold flat. You would need to look after it a bit more. It doesn't really tend to support models in upper floor ruins so well. The grid layout can mean there's a bit less flexibility than some. It can create some firing lanes in 40k that it could be nice to just add an extra ruin terrain piece to block a lane or two. I feel like that can help out quite a bit. It doesn't really make tournament approved layouts, but I've heard fair enough anecdotes that it's pretty usable for casual games. For the types of them, they've got 3 main sets on offer. This sort of Forgotten Furnace Chaos Foundry style one, all glowing runes and factory things. A more standard ruin city, Shattered Hive with some bombed out buildings and armoured containers. And then a more lush and verdant ruin set called an Overgrown Capital, maybe applicable to fantasy games as well as 40k. Each of those also has an expansion centerpiece set where you put 2 tiles together to make one bigger building, a cathedral type thing for the city and the capital, and a great big spire for the foundry. In any case, there'll be links down in the video description below if you want to check them out. As always, a big thank you to them for sponsoring a video. I'll leave this one there for now though. Let me know your thoughts as to the new mission pack down in the comments below. What do you make of the changes, and do you think that they're going to be good or bad for the game overall? If you'd like to support Auspex Tactics, then feel free to check out the affiliate discount links down in the video description. They can save some money when buying Warhammer 40k things, and they help to support the channel. And Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. A big thank you to anyone supporting there. It's the main thing that funds my video creation. Feel free to check them out if you'd like to, but otherwise a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.